Hello everyone. For those new to this channel, my name is Wayne Johnson. In the past, I made videos for boat builders, wooden boat builders, mostly of a technical nature. But today I'd like to break away from that trend. Let me explain. You are looking at a replica of a Norse rowboat found mostly intact that was buried in a Viking Age tomb outside of Oslo, Norway. Whenever I go to row or sail her, I am pleasantly surprised at the attention she draws. People of all ages seem drawn to its iconic profile and often seek more information about its history and construction than time on the water or boat ramp allows. Therefore, I'm making this video to more fully answer common questions posed by those curious about Viking Age boats. The most common questions I'm asked relate to its place in history. Is that a Viking boat? How old is it? Where did it come from? It is helpful to understand my Faering's place in history if we first look at the larger context of the history of watercraft in general. Viking Age boats are far from primitive. To drive that home, I made this timeline with years running from 0 to 40,000. 40,000 years ago, in the middle of an ice age, we know there was still 100 miles of open water between Australia and Indonesia, and the first people to inhabit Australia had to cross it somehow, maybe with rafts. About 13 to 15,000 years ago, the Channel Islands off the state of California were inhabited by a seagoing culture. The islands are far offshore, so they had to get there somehow, probably with skin boats. Dugout canoes and canoes with sails were found in depictions dating to 8 to 10,000 years ago. In the book A History of Seafaring, the editor George Bass writes, "It now seems that before there were either farmers or shepherds, there were sailors. Before people settled in villages and began to make pottery, they had learned to construct some sort of seagoing craft." By the beginning of historical times, all the necessary technologies to build a Norse boat had been invented. Paddles, oars, and sails were in common use. Planking, keels, and rudders were incorporated into most boats. The Polynesians were island hopping in the Pacific. The Mesopotamians were plying the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. The Egyptians were moving obelisks weighing hundreds of tons up and down the Nile. The Greeks were trading in the eastern Mediterranean, and the Romans and the Carthaginians were later trading all over the Mediterranean and Black Sea. Advances in ship construction were accelerated by the inventions of the Bronze and later Iron Ages to be used for tools such as adze and axe, and ship parts such as nail and rivet. The takeaway is the Norse boat builders had a millennia of boat building traditions to work with. What or who is Gokstad? Gokstad is the name of a farm south of Oslo, Norway, where a Viking chieftain or some kind of warrior was buried around 900 AD. The mound is presently about a mile from open water. The mound was excavated in the late 1800s, and they found a Viking longboat about 80 feet long with several other items buried with a chieftain or warrior. Included in the burial were farm goods and 3 small boats, one of which is the Faering, which I made a replica of. 3 tenders, one of which is the Faering, along with the mothership and other finds are on display at the Viking Ship Museum outside of Oslo. I grew up outside Duluth, Minnesota, and like other children visited the town's Leif Erikson Park. It was named for a Viking Age ship that was sailed across the Atlantic to Duluth, and then after being donated was displayed at the park. Being of Scandinavian descent, my curiosity for Viking lore was piqued. Years later, my wife and I visited the British Maritime Museum in Greenwich, England. ostensibly to put a foot on the prime meridian. I was pleasantly surprised when we discovered the museum had a display of a replica of the Gokstad Faering. I bought their report on their construction efforts with the goal of someday building one myself. For those of you who would like to know more about the history of boats, I recommend this second book. It was written by Basil Greenhill. He was a former director of the Greenwich Maritime Museum. It's called The Archaeology of the Boat. Both this book and The History of Seafaring by Bass have good chapters on the Gokstad ships and with excellent photographs. Faering is Old Norse for literally 4 oars. It seems that the Norse measured their boats by the number of oarlocks. For example, a boat with 6 oarlocks was called a seafaring. This seems strange to us as we measure our boats in other ways. Our small boats are often measured by the number of seats. For example, this is a 2-person kayak. Rowing shells are classified by seats. Note this 8-person shell has 8, not 16 oars because the rowers are sweeping, not sculling. Or they are measured by length. Here my wife and I are paddling our 17-foot Grumman canoe in Upper Priest Lake, Idaho. Sailboats are also measured by length, maybe to meet race class requirements or, as is often the case, to determine the monthly moorage charges. Measuring a boat by its oar count is more like our modern way of measuring a speedboat by its horsepower. More oars means more power against either wind or tide. What's our takeaway? Well, the Viking Age Norse seem to have categorized their boats not by passenger count or cargo capacity, but by row power. It would seem then that my faring was intended for use in environments with limited rowing demands, inland waters or protected coastlines. Or in the case of the Gokstad Faering, a tender to travel into shallower waters than what the mothership could negotiate, say to replenish provisions or trade. In this next section, we get closer to home. Let's look at the physical features of Norse rowboats that collectively distinguish them from other cultures. Those features that make these boats look iconic Viking. As we look at each of these features, I will add my 2 cents worth of why, after years of sailing and rowing my Faering replica, I think that these features were incorporated into their design. People say that the boat seems to ride low in the water. Why did the Norse design it with such little freeboard? Another characteristic is these extended stems. What's with that? It seems like a waste of wood. Probably the most recognizable feature of Viking craft is their profile. Relatively low midship freeboard with sweeping upturned and extended stems. The low profile does 2 things. It minimizes windage and also allows for proper cabe height, more on cabe later, so that rowing is ergonomically optimized. Of course, everything about a boat is a compromise between often competing requirements. The low freeboard limits the boat's use to areas where the wave turbulence is not too severe. From my personal experience, I'd say 3-foot waves with whitecaps is about the max for my faring, mainly because the spray tends to want to swamp the boat. The upturn at bow and stern, though pleasing to the eye, has a practical use. I found that, compared with other boats I've been in, the faring bow does not lift as quickly to oncoming and overrunning large waves. This necessitates an increase in freeboard at the boat's ends to prevent the wave from spilling into the boat. It is impressive to see the wave crest travel along the rail with nearly equal effective freeboard from bow to stern. Those Norse boat builders knew what they're doing. I found the extended stems a puzzle. Yes, they are a good place to mount a sea dragon to scare away bad things. But I found 2 uses for their added height. 1, the forestay and backstay are more easily kept clear of the sail yard and support the mast with less downward force. And second, at least for me, by stretching a rope across the stems, it allows me to create a tent so that I can shelter from unexpected weather. The first thing one notices is how long it is. I had to build a special trailer just to accommodate it. What we perceive as long, what we're really saying is a boat appears long for its width. This ratio of length to width, say 2 to 1 or 5 to 1, is a good measure of a boat's potential maximum hull speed. Long boats travel through the water at higher speeds than short boats. Also, relatively narrow boats tend to move through the water easier than wider ones. The science of hydrodynamics allows us to predict these hull shape speeds and moving resistances with precision, but the Norse perfected their hull shape by good old trial and error and got it right. We moderns view their hull shape as long because we are more used to seeing shorter planing hulls designed for modern high horsepower propulsion methods. A common, though more subtle feature of Norse boats is their lack of rocker, that is, the fore-aft curve of the keel. A lot of rocker allows a boat to turn easier. Whitewater kayaks and sailboats usually have more rocker and they're designed for that reason. Rowboats and sea kayaks, though, want less rocker and their design allows them to hold a straight course. Norse rowboats, like my Viking Faering, combine their long length and minimum rocker for that purpose. I have found that this ability to sort of hold a heading takes the pressure off the rower having to continually adjust his rowing stroke to minor changes in wind and wave, which brings up another ubiquitous feature of the Viking craft, the rudder. Rudders probably evolved from a steering oar, which had been in common use for thousands of years. The rudder is always mounted on the aft starboard quarter by means of two attachment points. The lower attachment is by way of a rope strung through a hole in the rudder and a boss attached to the hull. The second attachment is a leather strap pinning the rudder shaft to a cup groove at the gunwale. This strap acts as a shear pin would, braking under excess force from collision, allowing the rudder to swing clear. The strap can also be loosened manually, allowing the boat to enter shallow waters. This maneuver is not as easily accomplished with a rudder attached directly to the rear stem, which might explain why the Norse continued to use the steerboard. The tiller attached to the rudder runs athwartship, and in small boats often has a fore-aft stick at its end to facilitate operation. The Norse called the rudder a steerboard, which is where the term starboard comes from. Though a rudder has an obvious use for sailing, it is also useful while rowing. When rowing off the wind, boats tend to turn into or away from the wind depending on the amount of weather helm. The rudder can be set as a trim tab to compensate for any turning tendency. This feature complements the effects of small rocker and a long profile to make rowing more efficient. Friends who enjoy an outing in my Faering often remark on a feature of Norse boats that is not visually apparent, its sense of disconcerting instability. When getting in for the first time, one is struck by how the boat rocks side to side with every movement, what's called initial stability. Only after I have demonstrated by putting my full weight on the gunwale does the first passenger gain confidence in the boat's refusal to capsize, what is called final stability. Large boats often improve the final stability by adding ballast. However, small Norse boats accomplish their stability by the hull's cross-sectional shape. The V-shape of the hull's cross-section is apparent when one looks at my Faering from the end when it's on a boat trailer. The steepness of the V-shape is measured by an angle the boat builders call dead rise. Dead rise is the angle the hull makes with the horizon amidship at the keel. Boats with little dead rise tend to be initially stable, that is, they are not rocky, but are more easily capsized. Boats with a lot of dead rise, like the Gokstad Faering, tend to be initially rocky, but are very difficult to capsize. To test this feature, a friend and I, we both weigh about 200 pounds, we leaned on the gunnel with full effort. We pushed the gunnel underwater and the boat filled up, but it refused to flip. Try doing that with your canoe. There is another advantage to having a larger dead rise. This type of hull creates less drag than flat bottom hulls, again making rowing easier. What is the takeaway? It seems that the Norse Faering has all the features that optimize rowing in open waters under moderate wind and wave, but compromises were made. Low freeboard and initial instability were the accepted weaknesses that the Norse boatmen had to deal with. There is a feature of Norse boats that is not commonly queried about. Their lap-strake construction, sometimes called clinker-built. The Viking Age Norse boat hulls are made from overlapping boards, cinched together by rivet-like devices. This building technique was developed by the Scandinavian craftsmen hundreds of years before the Gokstad ship was built. This method makes for a relatively lighter boat. Why the Norse favored this method of construction is a mystery to me, but may have had something to do with the availability of superior trees growing in their regions. The building technique has been so successful that it continues to the present day worldwide and now seems so normal, its look is taken for granted. Even some aluminum boats use the lap-strake pattern to stiffen the sheets used to form their hulls. I've made some improvements, or at least what I think are improvements. I hope the Vikings looking down from Valhalla agree. Obviously, I've painted the whole boat, which they wouldn't have done. But underneath that paint is, on the outside, 4 layers of fiberglass cloth, and on the inside, 2 layers to protect the wood and isolate it from water. I left the stem sticking up higher than the original fairing. The original fairing was, they cut the stem at an angle like this, so it was pointing. But I decided to leave it a little taller so I could do some experimenting. And I also made these dragon heads so that I can mount them. The original fairing has an unadorned sheer strake, but I decided to go ahead and put an open gunnel. It creates an opening so I can use it for different purposes, and I put a rub rail on it. This rub rail actually helps because when there's a little wave action, it actually deflects some of the wave and keeps the spray out of the boat. I also put some thwarts in, what we laymen call seats. The original didn't have any, and I don't understand that. I don't know, maybe they sat on sacks of oats or something in order to roll. I also put some sealed boxes attached to the bottom of the thwart in order to create flotation. I strung a rope all the way around the internal part of the boat. It's on slides, and then I attached the tiller tender to it. That allows me to adjust the tiller and therefore the rudder to positions just right while I'm rowing. Don't have to get up and move. As mentioned before, the boat has a lot of dead rise, so the angle of the floor is kind of too steep to walk on. So what I did is I put some additional cross members, they call those floors, and then I put some decking in that flattens out the bottom of the boat where you walk. Makes it a lot easier to move about. Another problem created by the high dead rise is that all the cargo wants to fall to the center of the boat, and that just makes it hard to move around. So what I did is I strung a couple ropes from bow to stern, and then I wove in some netting similar to what fish netting is. Then I can put my cargo on the outside, it won't slide in, so it's not underfoot. The Gokstad fairing didn't have a mast step. I actually put 3 of them in, one here, and which is in the center of the boat, and a couple up forward, just for experimentation, different types of mast configurations. The original fairing was notched out on the sheer strake, and the cable was sitting down. It kind of puzzled me, so before I built the boat, I did some experimenting and realized that either the Viking that the boat was designed for was small, or they rode it sitting on the floor. I don't understand it. Anyway, I decided to raise the cable up a little bit, And then after I rowed for a couple seasons, I realized that I wanted the cable even a little higher, so I had to put in a spacer. This makes it ergonomically work for my size. Also, instead of tightening up the Humley band every time I wanted to use the oars, I decided to build this bungee cord affair in, which keeps a little bit of tension on the oar. It doesn't create any kind of binding. It works out pretty good. I think the Norse would have approved of the changes that I've shown you so far. At least they would have understood them. This, however, they would have had no idea what it's for. This is a motor mount that I made. I find on really windy days it's kind of nice to be able to use a motor to get back to the dock. How does your fairing roll? The short answer is great. For on open water with the wind under 10 miles per hour, my fairing excels, mainly because of its greater stability in choppy waters. With winds greater than 10, especially in open waters, canoeing can become somewhat hazardous. The fairing rowing downwind is a joy until the wave sets start to exceed 3 feet. Upwind is another story. A fit friend and I were caught in a 30-mile-an-hour gusting to 40 wind heading into a bay where the wave height would not develop. It wasn't a problem. With both of us rowing at our best, we barely made progress against the wind. The windage of the hull was, small as it is, overpowering. There is a conclusion that I reached concerning rowing a fairing that might be controversial. The boat can be rowed in 3 configurations. It can be rowed by, as the name implies, 2 people sculling, that is, each person using 2 oars for a total of 4 oars. It can be rowed by 2 people sweeping, that is, each person using just 1 oar, one on each side of the boat, for a total of 2 oars. And it can be rowed by just 1 person, with or without other passengers, the rower using 2 oars in either of the 2 rowing stations, for a total of 2 oars. Here's the thing. I don't think the fairing was normally rowed in a 4-oar configuration. Except when rowing against a stiff breeze, I have found that it is more efficient to take turns rowing. That is, one rower uses 2 oars while the other rower rests. A 20-minute cycle works pretty well. There may be some science to this. I towed my fairing behind a power boat, holding it with a rope attached to a spring scale, and I measured the tension in the rope with increasing speeds. It became clear that above 3 miles an hour, the forces needed to pull the boat started increasing exponentially, suggesting that the benefits of having a second person rowing for the purpose of increasing speed was inefficient in the long run. When rowing progress drops below, say, 1.5 miles an hour due to headwinds, adding a second rower only then makes sense because the added effort is used to overcome windage and does not increase the boat's speed into the higher and inefficient speed zone. Even when only 1 person is rowing, there is a benefit of having 4 caves, that is, 2 rowing positions. For directional stability, it is best to keep the weight near the stern of the boat when rowing downwind. That allows the bow to more easily weather vane downwind and consequently improve directional stability. But it is best to keep the weight near the bow of the boat when rowing into the wind. That lets the stern weather vane downwind and again improve directional stability. This weight shift can often be accomplished by just shifting the weight of the rower. That is, one can row from the more aft caves when rowing downwind, allowing the bow to lighten, and row from the more forward caves when rowing into the wind, allowing the stern to lighten. Having this option adds directional stability and minimizes the amount of trim and therefore drag required of the rudder. People ask, how does your boat sail? Well, the short answer is well enough. The fairing has several characteristics that, though enhancing its rowing performance, become a liability when sailing into the wind. The first and most limiting is its low freeboard. Even though the fairing shape leads to a good final stability, the amount of freeboard on the lee side, when sailing upwind is down to a few inches. This requires continuous attention to sail, wave, and wind to avoid shipping water. Another less critical, but nonetheless noticeable design issue is the hull's refusal to turn to windward while tacking. In most circumstances, the boat loses all headway before reaching the wind, forcing the sailor to help the boat finish the tack with oar or paddle, or worse, to wear instead of tack. That is to turn the boat downwind through an angle of 270 degrees, losing a lot of headway in the process. The boat's small rocker, a benefit for rowing, is a liability when tacking. Even so, the boat will sail into the wind well enough to get the job done, but only if conditions are favorable. For recreational purposes, it's quite enjoyable. But for the working North sailor, I'm sure that sails were not the best choice when going upwind. In my experience, when time was a consideration, you row to get the job done. The Faering's downwind sailing performance, by contrast, is excellent. As I will explain later, I have experimented with several sail configurations. They all worked well in propelling the boat downwind. In fact, in many cases too well. I mostly overestimated the sail size needed to move the boat. A relatively moderate-sized sail could easily push the boat to near maximum hull speeds, speeds above which the bow wave became a serious problem. I found in order to remain safe, I had to reef the sails at a much lower wind speeds than I had anticipated. For these and other reasons, I am sure that the Norsemen considered small sails to assist traveling downwind. It seems a no-brainer. These small sails would not require structural modifications to the hull in order to support the mast. This fact might explain why no modifications have been identified in the original Gokstad fairing. No sails dating to the age of the Gokstad ship have survived. However, depictions that do survive show the large Norse ships with a square sail. Why square sails and not other available and proven sail systems that were used by the Norse contemporaries elsewhere in Europe? I don't have an answer, and I question some of the reasons that have been put forth. So for the fun of it, I've done my own experimenting. I've made square Egyptian lantine and settee, Polynesian crab claw, balanced and standing lug sails, gunter, gaff, sprit boom, and others. I've combined these sails in several configurations, including cat, sloop, and yawl. Of course, I was experimenting with these sails on a faring boat. It is certainly true that it is not valid to extrapolate my conclusions about the effectiveness of these sails to the fairing's larger seagoing cousins. Here are some of the sail configurations that I have experimented with. The obvious sail to test was the traditional Norse square sail. I found it had good sailing characteristics at all points of sail, but especially going downwind. The sail spreads on both sides of the mast, keeping the generated forces balanced, but I decided it was not the best for two reasons. First, there are just too many lines to handle in such a small boat with limited crew. Think of trying to fly a kite with 7 lines. It seems that there's always one or more lines in a tangle. And second, with the mast amidship, it was very difficult to move from bow to stern. When trying to pass the mast, the hull tips to the side, causing the mast to lean in the same direction, blocking the way. One has to crawl on one's belly to negotiate the mast. Larger boats, of course, would not be hindered by either of these features. I next tried a lantine sail and its cousin, the settee, both of which have a long history in Egyptian waters. I tried these sails with the mast near midship and more forward. Again, the sail worked fine, both with and without a boom. However, at least in my configurations, it was not feasible to reef the sail, making gusty weather dangerous. I guess one of the more exotic sail rigs that I experimented with is the Polynesian crab claw sail. After starting with a smaller test sail, which was promising, I made a full-size rig. It was fun to sail, but I found that, like the lantine sail, it performs best in a steady, predictable breeze, conditions not found in the inland lakes of the Pacific Northwest. Maybe the mountainous Nordic shores have similar fickle winds. If any of you viewers have first-hand knowledge of the wind conditions in Northern Europe, please comment. A lug sail, a four-sided sail similar in many ways to a square sail, was developed early on by the Chinese sailors. The major difference is the attachment point of the halyard on the yard. The square sail is lifted at the yard center, while the lug sail is lifted at a point on the yard just aft of the leading edge or luff of the sail. As an experiment, I tried moving the halyard attachment point forward on my square sails to see if sailing performance in the wind would be improved. Finding that the weather helm became too strong, I then shifted the mast forward to bring the sail forces back in balance, with the added benefit of freeing up the center of the boat. I found that the fairing sailed into the wind slightly better, mainly because I could develop greater tension in the square sail's leading edge. However, to avoid pinning the sail against the mast on the opposite tack, the sail had to be lowered and then rehoisted on the other side of the mast. Probably in open water sailing, this drawback would have been worth it, but in nearshore conditions, dictating numerous tacks, it probably wasn't worth the effort. One of the classic sail configurations to deal with unruly weather helm is the yawl. That is, a large driving sail set forward on the hull, complemented by a smaller tail feather-like sail set as aft as practical, whose main purpose is to provide ample force to hold the bow into the wind whenever necessary. Sheets can be adjusted between the two sails to minimize rudder pressures no matter how the loads are distributed. Big advantage on a light working boat. I experimented with several sail types and found that when sailing to windward, they all work pretty good. I think the best choice was to use two lug sails because these I could easily reef when conditions warranted sail reduction. What are some of the takeaways about my fairing's performance under oar and sail? I think the most important conclusion is that the fairing was most likely used primarily as a rowboat. Even though it looks very similar to the larger Norse ships, scaling up provides greater freeboard, capacity for ballast, and room for larger crews, all necessary features needed to safely sail to windward with large sails. That said, a small auxiliary sail would most likely have been used on the Gokstad fairing when traveling downwind. To permit efficient use of hull space, I think any mast would have been set well forward. However, this configuration would have made windward sailing difficult without a second riding sail at the aft end. Though possible, I suspect the Norse rowers would have seen this addition as impractical. So, when rowing to windward, I think they probably would have lessened windage by lowering both sail and mast, and instead, if winds demanded, broke out a second set of oars.